Charlotte gripped the stem of her champagne flute tightly, the bubbly liquid trembling as she forced a smile. The gala was everything she'd expected: grand, extravagant, filled with people who thrived on wealth and status. And unfortunately, that included her ex, Daniel. She had hoped to avoid him, but fate had other plans. He stood across the room, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his arm draped casually around his latest conquest, a tall, stunning brunette in a designer gown. If that wasn't bad enough, his voice carried across the space, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I mean, look at her," Daniel scoffed, his lips curling in amusement. Charlotte always tried so hard to fit in, but let's be honest, she never belonged in this world. Laughter rippled through the small group of socialites surrounding him, their eyes flicking toward her like she was some charity case. Heat flamed under her skin, her stomach twisting in humiliation. Charlotte straightened her shoulders, refusing to let him see her crumble. But before she could muster a response, a deep, commanding voice sliced through the tension. "I can't say I agree," the voice declared, smooth yet firm. "From where I'm standing, Charlotte is the only person here worth knowing." The entire room seemed to freeze. Slowly, Charlotte turned her head, her breath catching as she met the piercing blue eyes of the man who had spoken. Philip Westwood, CEO of Westwood Enterprises. One of the most powerful men in the city. He was known for his ruthlessness in the boardroom, his wealth unmatched, his presence commanding. And now he was standing beside her, his broad shoulders squared, his expression utterly unreadable as he regarded Daniel with an icy glare. Daniel's smirk faltered. "Philip, I didn't realize you knew Charlotte." "I didn't," Philip said smoothly, his gaze never leaving hers, "but I do now." Charlotte's heart pounded. This was a man who could silence an entire room with a single glance, and he had just come to her defense unprovoked, unexpected. Philip turned his attention back to her, his voice dropping to something just for her ears. "Are you all right?" she swallowed. "I'm fine," she lied. His lips pressed into a thin line as if he didn't believe her, but instead of pressing further, he extended his hand. "Dance with me." It wasn't a question. Charlotte hesitated. Was this some kind of game for him? A way to put Daniel in his place? But the way Philip looked at her steady, unwavering, made it impossible to refuse. She placed her hand in his, and immediately, warmth spread through her fingers. He led her onto the dance floor, the orchestra playing a slow, elegant waltz. As he pulled her closer, Charlotte's pulse raced. He moved with practiced ease, guiding her effortlessly across the floor. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did," Philip countered. "No one should be spoken about like that, especially not you." She searched his face, trying to understand why a man like him, someone so untouchable, had stepped into her world, even for a moment. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Then don't say anything," he replied, his fingers tightening slightly around hers. "Just dance." And so she did. For the first time that evening, Charlotte wasn't thinking about Daniel, or the humiliation, or the whispers circling around them. She was thinking about Philip, about the way he held her, the way his eyes never left hers. And she had the strangest feeling that this night was only the beginning. Charlotte's heart was still pounding long after the waltz ended. Philip's presence had been overwhelming, his confidence effortless, and the way he had shielded her from Daniel's cruelty had left her breathless. Now, as the music faded and guests moved to their own conversations, she found herself searching for stability in the chaos of her thoughts. Philip, however, was unfazed. He led her off the dance floor with the same quiet authority he had displayed all evening, his fingers still lightly brushing hers. The contact sent an unfamiliar warmth through her, but she forced herself to focus. "I should probably thank you," she said, breaking the silence between them. Philip halted, turning to face her fully. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze held an intensity that made her pulse skip. "For what?" "For stepping in," she clarified. For he cut her off with a measured look. "No need." I don't tolerate men who tear others down to make themselves feel bigger. There was something final in his tone, something that suggested this was not about gallantry or appearances. He had meant what he said on that dance floor. Still, Charlotte wasn't used to this kind of attention, especially not from someone like him. She had spent years navigating rooms like this, trying to go unnoticed, trying to prove to people like Daniel that she was worth something. And yet, in a single evening, Philip Westwood had dismissed all of that, as if her worth had never been in question to begin with. She started to speak, but another voice interrupted. Charlotte, there you are. She turned to find Olivia, her best friend, bustling toward her with a pointed look. Olivia's eyes flickered to Philip, widening slightly in recognition, but she masked her surprise with practiced ease. I was wondering where you disappeared to, Olivia continued, linking her arm through Charlotte's. I hate to steal her away, Mr. Westwood, but I need a word. Philip's lips parted slightly, as if he was considering objecting, but after a moment he gave a small nod. Of course. His gaze settled on Charlotte once more. I hope this isn't the last time we speak tonight. The words sent a shiver down her spine, but before she could respond, Olivia pulled her away, weaving them through the crowd until they reached a quieter corner of the ballroom. Oh my God, Olivia exhaled sharply. Charlotte, do you have any idea who that was? Charlotte let out a breath, still processing everything. I'm aware. Olivia shook her head, incredulous. No, I don't think you are. Philip Westwood doesn't just talk to people at these events, and he definitely doesn't dance with them. Charlotte frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying, Olivia lowered her voice, that he's interested. Charlotte's stomach flipped. Interested? No, that couldn't be right. He had stepped in to help. He had seen Daniel's cruelty and had decided to intervene. That was all. Olivia studied her. You don't believe me? Charlotte let out a small, nervous laugh. It's not that, it's just… Men like him don't notice women like me. Olivia scoffed. That's nonsense, and you know it. He noticed you, Charlotte. And I think you should let him. Charlotte opened her mouth to argue, but something stopped her. A feeling, maybe, a weight in the air that hadn't been there before tonight. She glanced across the ballroom, her eyes instinctively searching for Philip. And when she found him, when she realized he was already watching her, her breath caught. Because in that moment, she wasn't sure she could deny Olivia's words. Maybe, just maybe, Philip Westwood was interested. Charlotte wasn't sure how the night had taken such an unexpected turn. One moment, she had been trying to blend into the background, and the next, she was the center of Philip Westwood's attention. And that attention hadn't wavered. Even as she spoke with Olivia, she could feel the weight of his gaze across the ballroom. It was steady, deliberate, and entirely unnerving. All right, Olivia murmured, eyes flickering between Charlotte and Philip. I was going to ask if you wanted to leave, but I don't think you should. Charlotte turned toward her. Why not? Olivia gave her a knowing look. Because that man doesn't just look at people like that for no reason. Charlotte exhaled, trying to steady herself. You're reading too much into this. Olivia shook her head. No, I'm really not. Before Charlotte could formulate a response, a low, familiar voice interrupted them. Ladies, Charlotte turned to find Philip standing beside her once more, his presence commanding as ever. Olivia, ever perceptive, took a step back. I'll leave you two to talk. As Olivia disappeared into the crowd, Philip's attention remained fixed on Charlotte. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. She hesitated. No, just a conversation. His expression remained unreadable. Good. A waiter passed by, and without missing a beat, Philip lifted 2 champagne flutes from the tray, handing one to her. She accepted it, though she wasn't sure she trusted herself to hold it steady. Tell me something, he said, his tone casual, yet his gaze anything but. Why do you let people like Daniel talk to you that way? She stiffened, caught off guard by the directness of the question. I don't let him, he just… does. Philip studied her for a long moment, then shook his head slightly. You don't strike me as the type to let anyone walk over you. Charlotte let out a breath, glancing away. It's more complicated than that. Is it? His voice carried no judgment, only curiosity. She met his gaze again, something in the way he looked at her making it impossible to hide behind vague answers. I spent years trying to prove myself in circles like this. People like Daniel don't think I belong, and I thought if I worked hard enough, if I carried myself the right way, I could change that. Philip tilted his head slightly, considering her words. And did it work? A bitter smile tugged at her lips. You were there, you heard him. Philip's jaw tightened, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Then maybe you're wasting your time trying to impress the wrong people. She blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of his statement. Before she could respond, he gestured toward the terrace doors. Walk with me. She hesitated, but something about the way he asked made it impossible to refuse. Stepping onto the terrace, Charlotte inhaled the crisp night air, grateful for the momentary escape from the suffocating atmosphere inside. Philip stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his presence both imposing and strangely grounding. You didn't have to do what you did earlier, she said after a beat. Philip exhaled slowly. I know. Then why did you? He turned his head slightly, watching her. Because I wanted to, she frowned. That's not an answer. A small pause stretched between them before he finally spoke. I don't like bullies. And I don't like watching people pretend they're more important than they are. She studied him for a moment, trying to decipher the man standing before her. He was unlike anyone she had ever met, controlled, deliberate, yet there was something beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. You barely know me, she pointed out. Philip's lips parted slightly, as if considering his next words carefully. Not yet. A shiver ran through her, though she wasn't sure if it was from the night air or the weight of his words. Somewhere inside, the music shifted, signaling the night's progression. But out here, time felt suspended, stretched between them like a thread waiting to be pulled. And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte wasn't thinking about Daniel, or about proving herself, or about anything other than the man standing beside her. Philip stood beside Charlotte on the terrace, the city lights stretching far beyond the railing, a glittering reflection of the world they both occupied yet experienced so differently. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, filled with unspoken thoughts neither had put into words yet. The crisp night air brushed against Charlotte's skin, but she barely noticed. Her pulse still raced from the evening's events, from the way Philip's presence had shifted the entire trajectory of her night, of her thoughts, of everything. He turned slightly, his gaze steady on her. Tell me something real, she blinked. What? You've spent the evening deflecting, giving answers that are careful, polished. I want to know something real about you. Charlotte hesitated. People in these circles rarely asked questions like that. Conversations were usually strategic, calculated. But Philip had already proven he wasn't like the rest of them. All right, she said, exhaling, something real. She glanced out at the skyline, gathering her thoughts. I used to think that if I worked hard enough, I could outrun my past. That if I dressed the part, said the right things, I'd finally be enough. Philip's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something deep and searching. And now, she let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. Now, I'm realizing that maybe I was measuring myself by the wrong standards all along. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. You are enough, Charlotte. Her breath caught. It wasn't a grand declaration, not an overly poetic sentiment. But it was said with such certainty, such conviction, that it left her momentarily speechless. She turned to face him fully, and for the first time, she allowed herself to really look at him not as Philip Westwood, the CEO, the man who had come to her defense tonight, but as someone who saw her. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened slightly, as if the answer was something he wasn't used to admitting. Because I don't do things I don't want to do, and I wanted to be here with you tonight. Her heart pounded at the weight of his words. There was no room for misunderstanding, no room for doubt. Philip Westwood had chosen to be here. He had chosen her. A shift passed between them, invisible yet undeniable. The city hummed around them, but within this space, within this moment, there was only them. Philip reached out, his fingers grazing hers, a silent question lingering in the space between them. Charlotte didn't pull away. She didn't want to. Philip's fingers brushed against Charlotte's, a fleeting touch that sent a current through her veins. She should have stepped back, should have put distance between them before she lost herself in the moment, but she didn't. Instead, she let herself exist in it, just for a little longer. The city stretched beyond them, a vast expanse of shimmering lights and distant sounds, but it all felt muted compared to the quiet intensity between them. Philip's eyes searched hers, and for the first time that night, Charlotte allowed herself to truly wonder what it would be like to trust someone like him. Not just because he had defended her, not just because he had seen through the walls she had carefully constructed, but because there was something about him that felt solid, steady. "I don't usually do this," she admitted, her voice barely above the hum of the city. Philip's gaze didn't waver. "Do what?" "Let my guard down." He considered that for a moment before responding. "Maybe it's time you did," Charlotte exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "It's not that simple." "It never is," Philip agreed. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." There was something about the way he spoke, direct, but never forceful, that made her pulse quicken. He wasn't demanding anything from her. He wasn't trying to fit her into some expectation. He was simply stating a truth and letting her decide what to do with it. For so long, she had measured her worth by how well she fit into the world that had constantly told her she didn't belong. And here Philip was, standing beside her as if the question of her belonging had never even been a consideration. Before she could formulate a response, the terrace doors swung open and the sounds of the party flooded back in. A familiar voice cut through the air, sharp and unwelcome. "There you are." Charlotte turned to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his expression carefully composed, though his eyes flickered with something close to irritation when they landed on Philip. She stiffened, instinctively bracing herself. Philip, however, remained utterly unbothered. If he had any reaction to Daniel's presence, he didn't show it. Daniel's gaze settled on Charlotte, his lips curving into something that was meant to resemble politeness, but failed. "I was hoping to speak with you before the night ended." Philip didn't move, didn't step away, but the weight of his presence was unmistakable. Charlotte lifted her chin. "I don't think we have anything left to say to each other." Daniel let out a short breath, as if her response was an inconvenience rather than a surprise. "Look, I know things ended badly between us, but there's no reason for hostility. We were friends once." Charlotte felt Philip watching her, waiting, but he didn't intervene. He was letting her handle this, letting her stand her ground. She met Daniel's gaze, her voice steady. "No, we weren't. Friends don't humiliate each other for sport. Friends don't tear people down to entertain a crowd." Something flickered in Daniel's expression, annoyance, maybe, or the realization that his usual charm wouldn't work here. Philip finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I think you've said enough." Daniel's eyes darkened as he regarded Philip. "You don't get a say in this." Philip's expression didn't change, but there was an edge to his tone when he responded. "I do when you refuse to listen." Daniel exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He looked at Charlotte once more, as if waiting for her to back down, to retreat. She didn't. After a long moment, Daniel scoffed under his breath and turned back toward the party, disappearing into the crowd. Charlotte released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Philip studied her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't need me to step in." She turned to him. "Maybe not, but it was nice knowing I didn't have to handle it alone." A slow nod. "You never do." Something in his voice struck deep, something that made Charlotte realize how profoundly different he was from the people she had spent years trying to impress. The night was drawing to a close, the party winding down, but the weight of what had happened lingered between them. Charlotte had spent so much time trying to prove herself to people who had never deserved her effort. And in one night, Philip had shown her that she had never needed to. As they stood there, the air between them charged with something unspoken, Charlotte realized she wasn't afraid of what came next. For the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out. The car ride was silent, but not uncomfortably so. The city lights flickered past the tinted windows as Charlotte sat beside Philip in the backseat of his sleek black car, her thoughts a whirlwind of the night's events. She had expected the gala to be another evening of forced smiles and social maneuvering. Yet here she was, leaving in the company of a man she had never anticipated crossing paths with so intensely. Philip's presence beside her was steady, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, though she could feel his attention on her in the quiet way he carried himself. There was no pressure, no expectation, just the reality of two people who had collided in ways neither had planned. As the car smoothly glided through the city, Philip finally broke the silence. "Are you all right?" Charlotte turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "Yes, just processing," he nodded, as if understanding without her needing to elaborate. "Tonight didn't go as you expected." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "That's an understatement." The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but something close. "Then let me make one more unexpected decision." Before she could ask what he meant, the car slowed, pulling up to a grand building, its towering glass windows reflecting the city around it. The driver stepped out and opened the door, and Philip turned to her, waiting. Curiosity flickered through her. "Where are we?" He didn't answer right away, only extended his hand, an invitation. Charlotte hesitated, but something told her this was a moment she didn't want to let slip past her. So she placed her hand in his, letting him lead her into the building. The elevator ride was quiet, the hum of the city fading behind them. When the doors opened, Charlotte's breath caught. They stepped into a penthouse, spacious, modern, yet stunningly warm. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, casting a golden glow over the elegantly furnished space. The air carried a faint scent of cedar and something crisp, something distinctly Philip. She turned to him. "You brought me to your home." He leaned against the wall, watching her. "Would you have preferred somewhere else?" Charlotte shook her head, moving toward the windows. "No. I didn't expect this." Philip moved closer but didn't crowd her. "I didn't want the night to end with unfinished thoughts." She turned, her heartbeat steady but insistent. "And what thoughts would those be?" His eyes held hers, unwavering. "That you've spent too much time trying to prove yourself to people who don't deserve you. That you are more than enough as you are, and that I don't want this to be the last night I see you." Her breath caught. Philip Westwood was not a man who spoke in half-truths. He was decisive, deliberate, and right now all of that certainty was directed at her. Charlotte's pulse quickened, but she didn't retreat. "You barely know me." His expression didn't shift. "Then I'd like to change that." The intensity of his words settled deep in her chest, not overwhelming but steady, grounding. This wasn't the kind of fleeting interest she had encountered before. This was something different. She let out a slow breath, her fingers grazing the cool glass of the window. "People like you don't usually notice people like me." Philip stepped closer, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "People like me," she exhaled. "The ones who walk into a room and own it without trying, the ones who never doubt where they belong." Philip studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You think I've never questioned where I belong?" Charlotte hesitated. "Haven't you?" Something shifted in his eyes. "Not in the way you think. But I've spent a long time surrounded by people who only see what they can gain from me. It makes you question who's real and who's playing a role." She hadn't considered that. To the outside world, Philip was untouchable, powerful. But standing here, listening to him speak, she realized that even someone like him could feel isolated in a crowd. "Then maybe," she said softly, "we both have something to learn." Philip reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, a question, not a demand. Charlotte didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, allowing the space between them to disappear. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about the past. She wasn't thinking about proving herself, about fitting in, about being enough. She was simply here with him, and that was enough. Philip's hand lifted, his fingers tracing a gentle path along her jaw before he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers with a softness that belied the intensity between them. The kiss wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate. It was deliberate, just like him. And Charlotte knew without a doubt that this was just the beginning,